Hey Ecofictologists, welcome back to my channel. Today I am super excited to welcome a new face onto the channel. This is Josh, or as you will see on his books, Joshua Phillip Johnson, and we are here to talk about his book, The Forever Sea, which I read not too long ago, and I swooned. I loved it. It was so much fun. And thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm very excited. Yeah, Joshua is fine. Yeah, we went with Joshua Phillip Johnson because it was the best version of a pretty boring name. So, but we what we got.
Well, I guess the easiest way to start would be to ask you for a spoiler-free short little summary of what the Forever Sea is and
Yeah.
what kind of story readers could expect.
Yeah, so I'm terrible at summaries of my own book, and you would think that I would have gotten better by now, but I'll just, give you my sort of best version. So The Forever Sea is marketed as an eco fantasy, and I'm sure we'll talk about that
We
and
will
why.
talk about
Um,
that.
and I think there are lots of different ways to think about the book, but the way that I think about it is it's the story of a woman who is sort of interested in the environment around her and in the sort of she's interested in looking in places where you're not supposed to look. So she is a sailor aboard this boat. In this world, there are boats that sail on prairie grasses instead of water. And so she sails on one of these boats and is a kind of engineering character. And the story starts when her grandmother, who's a kind of famous sailor, disappears into the sea, into this prairie sea. And everybody kind of assumes she's just gone. She, died. And this character named Kindred, the main character, doesn't quite believe that. And so she sort of sails out beyond where you're supposed to go, and she is interested in sort of what's going on below the waves, and hijinks ensue. And so, yeah, hijinks will be the spoiler-free part there. You can
Yeah,
sort
it's
of
a
pack
good
much into
blanket
hijinks.
term. It's a
Yeah,
good
yeah,
umbrella.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, yeah, so that's my summary, I guess.
Is it too much of a spoiler to say there may or may not be pirates in this book?
I think the pirates are on like page 1, right? So it's probably not much of a
I
spoiler.
mean, the cover has a massive ship on it. Everyone's
Yeah,
gonna jump to pirates, right?
yeah,
Just
yeah. I mean, this,
because it factors into a question I want to ask you, so I need the pirates to be
yeah, the
established.
pirates are there. But I wanted to write a story that maybe had familiar elements set in a really unfamiliar space. And so, pirates and monsters and, all, walking the, I guess, I don't think anybody walks the plank, but it's that kind of thing. Yeah, yeah.
Well, that actually leads me right into my next question. Was that the inspiration for the book that you wanted to write a story about ships and pirates and monsters from the deep?
I think it was one of the inspirations. So I live in Minnesota, in an area called the Prairie Pothole region, which isn't a particularly nice name, I guess. It doesn't sound especially appealing, but it is very beautiful. And right now, it's of course just monoculture farm fields, right? It's just soybean, cornfields, etc. But it used to be tall grass prairie, and there are little patches of it still around. And so a big part of my inspiration was, sort of walking around here and both in imagining what this place used to be and thinking about what it is now. And so, I was out for a walk one day and I saw this patch of grass, and it wasn't prairie, it wasn't blue stem or anything like that. But it was just a little tiny field that I think a farmer had maybe let grow fallow. And so it was this tall kind of weedy grasses and stuff. Um, but it's really windy out here, and it just, it looked like an ocean, right? It looked like water. And I'm not I'm not like the first person to have that observation, right? Lots of people have noticed that before, but I think once you make that leap into seeing it as water, there's a really easy next jump into sort of imagining boats on that, right? So you just have that first little novum, that first little what if, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, so if it's water, then what, right? Or if it's a sea, then what? So I put boats on seas, and once there are boats on there got to be pirates, right? And
There's
once
got to
there are
be
pirates,
pirates.
etc. So it's just this like sort of, logical sequence of dominoes that start falling down. So some of it was wanting to write a sort of, adventure story. Some of it was wanting to write a story about a place or an environment that I feel like only exists in these little sort of postage stamps around this area now, these kind of little penned in areas. And part of it was trying to write a story about a character who um, just sort of doesn't look at the world in the way that other people do, and the experience. I mean, you probably experienced this too. I'm curious what your thoughts are, but like it's a curious time to be an environmentalist and to sort of look at the world in a way that you often feel like you're sort of looking at it in a sort of rogue way, or in a sort of in a way that's not really sanctioned, right? To look at the natural world and not immediately think of like use value or sort of productivity or something.
Hmm.
And I live in an area where farmers are constantly having to think about things like that, right? What's the yield I can get out of this, square acreage or something? And so, it's a time when I think we have to ask like really fundamental questions about like like how we look at the world around us. And so I wanted to write about a character who is struggling with that, right? Who is kind of reading against the grain, the world around her.
That's so fascinating. I mean, yeah, the ecological messages obviously spoke to me in this book. I look for those in
Yeah.
books that I read now. Um, and I was really curious kind of which aspects you were really wanting to focus on. I mean, you mentioned quite a range of them in the book. Obviously, this kind of fragmentation of wildness and our need to tame the
Yeah.
wild around us, and
Yeah.
reducing biodiversity and some species becoming rarer. And then of course in this book, like the prairie gives you the forever sea gives you everything, right? It gives you all of your resources. So when certain things go missing, there are shortages in certain other things. And I thought that was really, really interesting.
And I want to be like super clear. I'm not a scientist, right? So I don't sort of know ecological theories, and I can't, etc. Right? I'm not that person. Um, but I think there's also room at the table to talk about the bigger ideologies that are behind why we do certain things, and how we appreciate certain things, and what might be lost if we think in certain ways or ignore certain things, that sort of thing. And so, I think there's a way in which, Kindred is a character who I think is sort of an idealist, and makes some mistakes because of that, right? And I think we're at a weird point in time right now where idealism, and when it comes to the environment, can be a really positive motivating force, but also we have to deal with some like pretty grimy realities at the end of the day, right? There are lots of competing interests for things like resources and space and all of that stuff. And so there are really hard decisions that we have to make. And and yeah, I don't know that sort of wide-eyed idealism is always the best way to do it, right? Because the farmers around here are sort of answering a need, right? Or not a need, a desire, I guess, more socially for certain kinds of food, or for certain, whatever. But also, they're like people who have families to feed, and are doing their best. And so, I worry sometimes that Kindred as a character reads as like, if only we could just be in perfect harmony with nature, and then everything would be fine. And she may believe that, but I don't know that I do, right? I don't think that's the way forward. And so yeah, it's such a tricky thing. And like I said, I don't pretend to be an ecologist or a biologist in any way, right? So yeah.
But I don't think you need to be. I mean, these kinds of conversations, they're not about science really.
Right.
They're, you know, if only the system were based on science and
Right. Yeah.
ecology.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
not. And
Yeah.
well, not biological sciences, it's based on other sciences, I
Yeah.
suppose. And No, I don't think being a scientist is a requirement to have these conversations. And this is why ecofiction is so wonderful, because it gives people a medium to
Yeah,
talk about these things. You know, sometimes it's really hard to have these conversations that are so inherently depressing. And you don't want to be that person that's always talking about these
yeah,
things. But you know, you read it in a book and suddenly you can start a conversation with like, oh,
yeah,
I read this book. It was really good. Have you
yeah,
read it? Do you want to talk about it?
yeah,
And yeah, and I think ecofiction, you can talk about it in a language that everyone understands, because obviously science, this statement like, oh, I'm not a scientist, so I don't really know.
yeah,
That's because science is so inaccessible, and the way we talk about it is so inaccessible that there is this divide between, you know, a person who is not a scientist and someone who studies science.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I love that, you know, people who are not trained in the sciences are writing books about ecological themes and messages, because
yeah,
it has to come from everywhere, and
yeah.
everyone
That's
is, you
right.
know, qualified.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's so important. I think no one book is the whole conversation, right? No
No.
one paper or one lecture is the whole conversation. So it's so great to see people coming at these discussions from so many different angles, right? And to have books floating around and articles and scientific lectures and all of that stuff, sort of cross-pollinating, right? So yeah, I like that a lot.
I mean, it's really interesting that you chose fantasy to, I mean, it sounds so natural when you talk about it, like, oh, I saw some grass and I thought of it as a sea and now they're pirates. Of course it's a fantasy novel.
Yeah,
You can't make that
yeah,
anything other than
yeah,
other than a fantasy. Have you always been a fantasy author, or was it, you know,
yeah.
was
It's a
this a
good,
story that had to be told in fantasy?
yeah, it's a good question. So I've always been a fantasy reader. It's been my favorite thing to read for a long time. And of course, at first, when I started out, I was like an 8-year-old or whatever reading. um it was just like a fun thing, right? Like magic was cool to think about, or dragons were cool to think about. And that was it. I think as I got older and I started reading different kinds of fantasy, right, or different kinds of speculative work, I started to realize that these genres have real sort of power behind them. And I think kind of, I don't want to sound like too, I think there's a way to talk about this where you lose some of the magic of the genres, right? So I don't want to say like they have rhetorical strategies that can, I don't want to say that, right? But I do think different genres can sort of bring different approaches or um, sort of perspectives or ideas or tools to the table, to sort of pick apart different topics, right? So, there are lots of people writing environmental novels that aren't doing so speculatively. I was thinking a lot about like what can fantasy bring to this discussion, especially when fantasy is often seen as this thing about stuff over there, right? We're just talking about made up stuff. And and it feels somewhat irresponsible, I think, on the surface to say like, I'm going to write about this really pressing important thing, um, via this kind of made up nonsense over here, right? But it seems to me that fantasy is all about sort of giving a new perspective on our world, right? Or sort of, um, gaining a different lens or something like that. Maybe escaping, but escaping so that we can turn around and look at our world from a new vantage point. And so, I was thinking a lot about how, for instance, like the prairie as a space, as a landscape, or an environment is seen as this sort of boring, flat, plain. You drive through it and you say, "There's some grass," and then you move on, right? And really, right? If for people who study the prairie, and I'm not somebody who studies the prairie, but I'm very interested in it. Um, it's hugely diverse and interesting, but what it requires is like you to look at it for a little while, right? To sort of sit with it. And and fantasy seems like a genre where delight and awe and wonder are sort of baked in, right? There's a kind of inherent sort of sparkliness in fantasy that I thought I want to bring this to an area that is often seen as the opposite of that, right? So I want to have readers looking at just grass with the same sort of sparkly-eyed wonder as they would look at a wizard casting some magical spell that, you know, delights and awes or whatever, right? So I think fantasy as a genre does that really well. Other genres can do it, but it seems really baked in to the core of fantasy in a way that it maybe isn't in some other genres. So yeah, so I think part of it was just a kind of arbitrary, like, I read a lot of fantasy and I like writing fantasy, so probably I'll write fantasy. But as I got into it, I sort of thought more about, like, well, what tools do I have with this genre that I could bring to bear on this?
Oh my goodness, there's so much to unpack. You're making me so happy with all of these things, because these are things that I've been talking about a lot recently, kind of the role that fantasy can play in this kind of ecological fiction,
Yeah,
and also the kind of the role of, I've been having some conversations recently about activism, ecofiction being a form of activism, and
yeah,
what you said there about it feels slightly irresponsible to, like, yeah, I'm taking this very real and urgent and depressing topic, but I'm gonna talk about it kind of over here with some monsters and some
yeah,
magic and
yeah,
and things. And for some reason, even though for me it's very clear, I find it hard to justify in that way.
yeah.
But I think one of my favorite fantasy authors, Cornelia Funke, who wrote the
Hmm.
Inkheart series,
Yeah,
she said that fantasy fantasy worlds are just our world wearing a different costume, and they're just a way to hold a mirror up to our own world with enough distance that you can kind of look at it critically. And I think that's really true, because I think if you start talking about something like this, um, in the real world, in people's backyards, that kind of puts their own actions up for question, then they get very defensive. They put their walls up and they're not open to this kind of discussion. But if you
yeah,
put it in a fantasy world where they can have this kind of bird's eye view they're watching,
yeah,
then they themselves start making these judgments like, that's not quite
yeah,
right. That system shouldn't work like this. This is atrocious. And
yeah.
then they're like, hmm, I think I've seen that somewhere before.
Wait a minute, hold on.
Hang on.
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
so I think you're absolutely right. I think fantasy does that very well, as well as kind of re-inspiring this awe and wonder in nature. I find
yeah,
that.
yeah. I think that's right. I mean, you know, I think a lot about for whom I'm writing these books, right? And in, you know, in my heart of hearts, I often sort of hope that some person who doesn't care much about the environment, or is maybe even kind of, you know, some climate change denier, or somebody who, you know, is kind of antagonistic towards the environment, picks the book up and, you know, is sort of, you know, I sort of inception this person into,
Yeah.
you know, suddenly becoming an environmentalist, right? They get to the end and they say, oh my gosh, what happened? You tricked me or something. Um, and, you know, I think maybe that can happen. I think the more likely scenario for that person is that, you know, a couple of years down the road, this book becomes a seed that, with a whole bunch of other things, grows into, you know, some thoughts that suddenly push their way forward, right? I
Mhm.
think that, you know, I think that that can happen. I think also, you know, I want to write books for people who are already environmentalists, or who are already sort of, you know, you know, they recognize that climate change is a problem. They recognize that this is something that that we can do. You know, we can do something about this, or should do something about this. And maybe they just don't feel the spark to act. Right. I
Mhm.
think there are a whole lot of people who would sort of nod along as you say, like, this is a problem, we need to do something, and then they won't do anything. Right.
Mhm.
Because the leap from belief to action is sometimes a big one. And I think books can help kind of fan that spark into a flame. And so I want to write books for those people too, right? I think it's a great genre for talking about climate issues, and it seems like more and more people are writing in it, right? Which is good. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me very nicely to the question of marketing,
Mm.
because you were saying that, it would be amazing if even like a climate denier or someone who doesn't really look twice at a prairie
Yeah.
would pick up your book and suddenly have like an aha moment. The fact that you put eco fantasy novel on the front of your book
Yeah.
might make it less likely for one of those people to pick up the book.
I know.
But I love that it says eco fantasy on the front because
Yeah.
I think it's bold and I think it's interesting and it's making a statement, and because it's one thing to write a story where the reader has permission to, oh, okay, I see a little bit of commentary on
Yeah.
resource management, but it's a really cool pirate story and I just want to
Yeah.
read it for the pirate story.
Yeah.
But putting eco fantasy on the front makes the reader go, okay, I'm going to learn something in this book.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, was that your decision or your publisher's decision? Did you have to fight to have that on there?
Yeah. It's a good question.
Yeah.
So I think it was the publisher's decision. I don't remember any moment where I said like this must be on the front cover,
Okay.
but the way that we always talked about the book, me and the editors and the teams at both publishers, was always about it as an eco book, right? As an eco
Mhm.
fantasy. And I think it is important to me. I don't know. So I was in this, I was doing another sort of Zoom call event a while ago, and I was talking with a couple of other writers, and one of them brought up the fact that like we often talk about fantasy as this kind of metaphorical genre where we talk about something that doesn't exist as a way to help readers understand the thing that does,
Mhm.
right? And so maybe we talk about fantasy racism with the hope that people read this and better understand actual racism.
Mhm.
And one of the other writers made this great point that like if those two things are too far apart, right? If the link between them requires a lot of really careful reading, some readers just aren't going to get it.
Mhm.
And if this sort of metaphorical thing really worked, we might have seen more progress, right, than
Okay.
sort of we currently have, right? And if this sort of metaphor worked so perfectly in fantasy, we wouldn't need to keep doing it, but here we are needing to keep doing it. And so, I think there is some real value in rewarding readers who are reading really carefully, and giving them something at the end where they realize this is what we've really been talking about this whole time. But I think there's also real value in saying, I'm talking about the environment, or I'm talking about racism, or I'm talking about sexism, or whatever it might be. Um, just to be very clear about it. And you know, does that cut some readers out or push some readers away? I don't know, maybe, right? But the other thing is like, my book isn't the only one talking about the environment, and maybe a different book will grab them, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so, you do the best with what you've got, and I do think that it's important to be clear on some level about what you're talking about. Just because I don't want anybody walking away from the book saying it was just about pirates or something like
Yeah.
that, right? I want them to say it was about pirates, but also it was about this other stuff. And if sort of slapping it on the cover can help, then I'm for it, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's such a tricky line to walk, though.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much for taking the time
yeah,
to
thank
chat
you,
with me today. It was such a pleasure to talk to you, and all the best of luck with
thank
the
you.
endless song. And yeah,
Yeah.
how can people find you if they want to know
Oh,
more about you and your projects?
sure. So I'm currently taking a Twitter break, but I'm sometimes on Twitter at Johnson Joshua P. I also have a website, joshuaphillipjohnson.com. I think that's what the website is. Let me check. I should just Joshua Phillip Johnson. Yeah, joshuaphillipjohnson.com. And that is like info about, stories that I've published and whatnot. And I occasionally update a sort of journal there just to talk about what's going on. Um, and I have an Instagram that I almost never use.
Okay.
Um, and I don't even remember I don't
Handle.
remember what the username is. I think that might be, no, it's like Joshua
I
under.
think I have you.
Do you have it?
I think I might.
I'm just never.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
it's just it's Joshua underscore Philip underscore Johnson.
there it is. Yeah, good. And I occasionally post pictures there. mostly currently of like my cute dog and my cute daughter. That's
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah, there was a picture
So
of your daughter running through a field of grass, and I think you had the kind of
yeah,
caption, the photo that inspired the Forever Sea,
yeah,
and I was like, this is so cool.
it's amazing, right? I mean, it's like that could have been
The
the
cover.
cover of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so that's probably the easiest way to find me. And my email is up on my website, I think. Um, and you're always more than welcome to email me. I'm always happy to hear from people and chat. I think probably there are some writers who are like famous enough that they're like don't contact me. I
Don't
like
email me.
many, but I am not famous. So if you want to, email me, I'll email you back and we can chat. So that's fine. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's
well,
the
I took that plunge. I was like, I'll just
yeah,
take this long shot.
yeah,
I'll just
it was
email him,
awesome.
see if he wants to chat.
Yeah, I was very happy to get that email. So yeah, I would love to hear from people if anybody wants to email. Yeah.
Excellent. Well,
So
thank you
yeah,
so much again, and
yeah, thank you.
that's all from us. So I'll see you next week, Ecofictologists.
Thank you.